So we're about 5 minutes after the open, and the participant list looks pretty stable. I think I recognize the names of everyone who's been here, but if it's not your, if you haven't been here more than 2 times, first time or your second time, I'd love to have a little intro from you. If by some chance I've confused which meeting I know somebody from, totally happened. And I'll drop the link again in chat to our note-taking doc. Feel free to add yourself. I'm gonna play Ed for a moment and remind everybody to reach out to other communities. And we want to get more collaboration across.
Would you like me to share the agenda so everyone can see the agenda?
I'll pull it up in a moment.
Perfect. I'm not at all territorial on that matter.
Yeah. Like we were just talking about, having more connections to Docker. We've got a couple other different communities that have gotten some updates, but there's a bunch of still opens there. So if you know folks, please reach out internally, externally, through friend networks, however it might be. We really do need to get more integration across these communities for this project's larger goal of being an accepted common way that all these communities do the same thing. There's a little update I want to share on that coming from the OpenSSF. There is a new working group being formed in the OpenSSF to get collaboration across all the packaging format maintainers. And so it might be nice to have somebody other than me from this meeting also join that meeting to sort of both raise awareness across packaging format maintainers of our work and get input from them and invite them back to this meeting. So please do that, somebody, or ask me where it is and I can, David, you have a hand up or you're volunteering?
Yes, I do have a hand up, and just going back to the Docker conversation, I've been having a lot of chats with Justin about GitBOM. And so there's more of a logistics issue there than anything else in terms of having Docker participate. I've also been having conversations with the snyk folks. They will have somebody participate in GitBOM very shortly.
Wonderful.
So, yeah, please do also work your channels. There's nothing wrong with like hearing it from more than one mouth. But I feel confident that we will have representation from both.
So are they going to sneak into our meetings?
Yeah, we're going to sneak Sally through the alley.
Love it. Jeff, I saw your hand, and then Elliot.
Yeah, on the community outreach topic, the Yocto project gave a good presentation to SPDX last week. And so I then reached out as a follow-up to that to say, hey, I think that you guys would be really interested in what we're doing in the GitBOM community. So we'll see if we can get their participation here, at least for a meeting.
That would be fantastic, especially since they think they're mostly C-ish and we're sort of making progress on that with the LLVM stuff.
Yeah, and hopefully then we can get them to fix their SBOMs because they're broken. So that's a whole other subject. The other community that's getting in the game is Global Platform and iotopia. Now they have a different, they've got a bit of a different take than all the others. They're not out to write protocol specifications or format specifications or anything like that. What they're out to do is to sort of make heads or tails of putting them all together. So operationalizing the what it means to have this information. So this in particular is to remediate against the myriad of relationships that are available in SPDX and which ones to actually use, when to use them, and which ones to stay away from, and stuff like that. But there are other things that they might also want to do, like, for instance, how do you link an SPDX SBOM to a CSAF vulnerability? And what should a developer do? How should you, what naming conventions are important to use in that context in terms of your either in terms of pearls or in terms of other names that are available. And also this will come back to the hash.
So perfect, Elliot, because I was also going to bring up this conversation. So within SPDX, we're looking to do a patch for the version 2 of the spec. And then of course, version 3 is coming out, which will be a lot of very big changes. So what we're trying to accomplish with the version 2 of the spec is, what can we do to accommodate linkage to other types of metadata, for example, the CSAF document that you just brought up. And so we do have a proposal out right now that we're working on that should be able to accommodate linking between an SPDX document and GitBOM identifiers and CSAF documents. So that will have to become a PR and get reviewed and whatnot, but have gotten it at least into the initial proposal.
So quick point of order on all of that. We do have a link to the spreadsheet where we're trying to track communities and folks who are reaching out to them. I think it's generally writable. So if the folks who brought up the iotopia and the stuff that the various folks are reaching out to Docker with and the SPDX CSAF stuff, if you could feel free to add lines and list yourselves as reaching out towards folks. And if you've got consent from the community contact, listing them, and then any sort of notes you have on the status, that's helpful as we sort of go back and try and, we will eventually get to the point where we'll have to track all the contacts and sort of figure out what happened with them, and that'll be very helpful.
URL, please.
Hang on a second. Let me do the following. I will share, pardon me, just getting over a cold.
My primary computer just crashed, so I just turned on my camera from my alternate computer.
So give me a second. I will share the agenda, and it is right there in the agenda, and I will point to it. Let me share the agenda. Let me narrow it down so the font size gets to be reasonable for folks.
Thanks, Neil.
Perfect. And essentially it's right here, listed in the meeting minutes. And it's sort of a standing item in the meeting minutes. So the attempt was to make it easy to find.
I can hear you all and I can still participate. I'm just kind of at a handicap
Okay.
while having my usual screen. So please do continue. I just can't as easily.
That's absolutely fine. That's absolutely fine. So I think that was sort of reaching through the community outreach item. And next up was spec repo things. So first, I did want to point out, I threw a bunch of stuff into the agenda, much of which is carried forward from the last meeting. Please, folks, for the love of God, if you have other items you'd like to add, please do add them. We keep pretty much an open agenda. A lot of this is, as I said, carried forward from the last meeting, in particular because there were a couple of places where I think we mostly reached some decisions. And then the other thing is, do we want to rearrange the order of any of the things in the agenda, given that it's sort of full?
So I did merge the drafts. I didn't merge the scope document. I think that needs a lot more work before we merge it and discussion, but I did merge the overall governance structure and licensing of that. Yep, I merged that one, and I merged the your pre-draft status specification. Yep.
Okay.
I felt that was close enough to what we've all been working against from the white paper that we wrote last year, that it's clearly marked that as pre-draft. I'm comfortable with it as such. And at this point, we can probably debate smaller change sets than the overall item. I would love to make some progress on a couple of the smaller decisions here we've been talking about for several meetings, like gitref to gitoid, directory names, things like that. I'd love to have agreement by the end of today, so those can become PRs to the docs if needed.
Yeah. So let's walk through a few of the things that were that I think we agreed on last time, just in case there were folks who weren't here, because I know some folks weren't. So I think the first thing we agreed on was that we wanted to deprecate the use of gitref in favor of gitoid. And that's going to entail some updates to the website and sort of some other places in terms of documentation. I do apologize, I've not actually carried forth the mechanics of that yet, but I believe that we had settled on that. If there are people who feel strongly differently, do feel free to speak up. That's absolutely a thing. Sometimes you miss really important reasons. But that was one of the things I think we'd figured out last time, and it seemed pretty uncontroversial last time. Okay, the second thing I think we sort of arrived at as a decision was that unequivocally in the spec, we should be using DAG in the spec because it is a DAG and not a tree. And then we want to try and move that into other places for communication as well, but keeping in mind that we do need to maintain comprehensibility to people who are less DAGgy. I think we've got Dave Pollock's hand up. You're muted, Dave.
Sorry, Solomon, the guy that founded Docker, is now all about the DAGs. So he's going to pave a lot of the DAG language with his new dagger.io startup. So I think using DAG will actually just be part of a wave. We'll just be early members of the wave, which is a good thing.
I feel like that argument that makes the argument even more piercing.
Okay, is this going to be the all pun from Ed meeting or?
Yes, please. It's Tuesday. It might as well be.
All downhill from here.
Yeah.
All right. So, but effectively, I think we came to pretty strong consensus on this point as well, like unequivocally for the spec, and then figuring out how to get clarity in the other communications that are less spec-y. So I just wanted to double click that. The next thing we talked about was the .bomb versus GitBOM directory. And we didn't come to a firm conclusion overall about the question, but Nell and a bunch of other people observed that if we use .gitbom, then we're going to get tab completion collisions with .git. And for many people, that will drive us completely around the bend in terms of insanity. And so I do recall, Youngkui, you had a very well-reasoned reason why you didn't want to use .bomb, and I didn't feel like I could do justice to it. Do you want to speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, I think previously I thought that there's a .bomb entry in the what's that tab out, the elf section, and also there's entry in the the archive, archive file. So when I want to insert .bomb entry into that archive, I must use a different folder because that .bomb file name will conflict with the .bomb the directory, right, in that directory. But I think I can use a different directory for that, right? That's adjustable. So it should still be fine if we want to use the .bomb directory. But at that time, I think I do not want to same name, right, for the direct name and that file name .bomb when I try to insert or extract from the archive file. That's my thought at that time. But
Cool.
if I use a different directory, or if I check before, I mean,
so
just some additional code to do the name conflict.
Yeah. So it sounds like your big issue was the observation that .bomb has potential difficulties because of the fact we use it for embedding as well, and so perhaps we want to have a different directory, and you just sort of naturally selected GitBOM.
Right.
Cool.
Yeah.
So you had your hand up, Dave.
Yeah, I think that it would be worthwhile to have an early spec on optional extensions, just like HTTP headers have, X dash as an optional extension. If we have directories within the main directory, whether that's .bomb or anything else, that are X underscore blah, 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 that will allow extensions where we can put stuff like Yankees, additional CVE metadata, etc. Does that sound like a reasonable idea?
All the metadata right now is put into the .gitbom directory. It's a subdirectory called metadata. In the same directory, I mean, there's the objects directory and the .bomb directory, right? So it's parallel to that objects directory.
So
right
I think you're bringing in a second really important point, Dave, that I think we need to actually pick up and put someplace, and maybe we should add it down to the new conversations pile. But I think there's sort of two questions, and they should both get the proper due. One is, what do we want to call the top level directory that we're recommending to build tools to write things out to? And the second one is, what kind of top level structure do we want to have? And then do we want specs for sort of common kinds of metadata formats that would be associated with it? Which I think is what you're getting to, Dave. Is that fair?
That's fair. I mean, the directory name, I mean, if we do .bomb, hooray. If we do whatever, hooray, I don't care. Within the directory, I believe we should have the specs for objects and oids or bombs. And then I think there should be other optional directories that over time, the optional directories then get promoted to a permanent part of the spec. But the optional directories or the additional directories are, X whatever, so that you can have vendors start adding their extra stuff in. And as there's kind of alignment around those extra directories, we turn those into standards, and we follow the same process the IETF does for HTTP header standards. Does that make sense?
Overall process, I like it. I think it's important to not bite off more than we can chew at once, and really focus our work right now on what is the minimum set of things we need to do. Let a sort of Wild West happen where people want to experiment. That's going to be important to keep doing that. Totally agree. But let's not try and solve those things that are predicated upon the sort of foundational elements that we have to agree on right now.
Agreed, 100%.
I think I saw Jeff and then Jeremy, but I could be wrong on the order.
I was just trying to focus on solutioning for the first part of this. Hey, we need to get a name so that we have consistency, I think, at the end of this meeting.
Yes, please.
So I was thinking about solutioning and trying to come up with two other examples because of the .bomb conflicts and the .git conflicts with GitBOM. One would be .oids, because that's what they are. And another one, at risk of confusing people, because we just had the discussion of these being gitoids, not git references, would be just .refs.
I think .refs suffers from the same generic issue as calling it .git. There are some languages that use similar things, but I think .oid is that object ID. My gut says that's open-ended enough while being specific enough that if someone else wanted to share that directory with us for the same purpose, it would make sense. Jeremy, go for it.
So I think the last spec meeting, the idea came up of distinguishing between discussions of the sort of fundamental data model and the fundamental design of the system, and then the question of like this directory and whether it should exist at all, and if so, what it should be called and how it should be structured is fundamentally an implementation detail. And so while it makes sense for it to be standardized as a point of interop, I wonder if it's worth explicitly calling out that it is a specific implementation, and that, like, other perhaps entirely different implementations are also possible within the same design and data model. Or is that
From the
Overcomplicated
perspective
things.
of the specification document itself, I think that is reasonable to do, to say here is the logical interface that everything must conform to. Here is an instance of how that looks in practice, and we suggest everybody use this because then we get more tool interoperability. But for example, there are some build systems, as you pointed out, and as I've had internal folks at Microsoft point out to me, some of our build systems wouldn't work easily with that. But with a clearly written example of the on disk or in directory structure could easily translate in or out of that as needed when interacting with other ecosystems. I hate saying both because that's more work, but I think both is the right answer.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, go ahead, Jeremy, sorry.
Well, if you're going to make another point on that, then go make it.
Well, I was sort of going to sort of expand a little bit, because one of the things I think Simpson was talking about last time that I think feeds into what you're saying is, it's one thing to say, if you happen to be a build tool that is persisting this into a directory structure on disk, you should probably do it this way. Or if you happen to be a build tool that's going to look for this information in a directory structure on disk, you should try and look for it this way. It's another thing entirely to say the only valid way to do this is to persist it on disk this way. And I think we want to avoid the latter, but I think there's a lot of value in having a standardization of the former, if that makes sense. How does that mesh? Because you've actually got honestly got examples on the ground where persisting this to disk and reading it from disk is not exactly what you're looking for.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, I think, so to be honest, I've spent like a big chunk of last week looking at the sort of fundamental data model of the spec, but I have not yet actually looked at how tools interact with each other. And so I'm not 100% sure what this directory is for or what we're putting in it. It's not obvious to me that it's necessary. So like there's a gap in my understanding there. That's kind of where I'm coming from at the moment. So
perhaps a way to solve that is just to say that the spec will define a canonical serialization, right, for how you would store this, and then we allow you to do it in other implementations.
Yeah, I think we need to be a little bit careful about the places where we put flex in the system, because I'm really strongly of the opinion that if you are, and this gets to your point, Jeremy, about figuring out why it is that we want to do this at all. And I've got some ideas, but they're not necessarily definitive. But if you're going to write this information out into a directory structure related to the artifacts you're reading and writing from the directory structure, I think there's a huge win in having everyone do it the same way if that's what you're doing. But if you're a build tool that is poking this up to a repo, an artifact repository in the sky, and that's where you logically should be also sticking out the sort of full set of GitBOM documents related to it, then obviously, if you're that build tool, you're not writing to disk in the directory structure, and so something has to be figured out in that space that makes sense for that particular kind of environment. Are we moving in a direction that makes sense to you, Jeremy, or because you're the ones with, like I said, with the real stuff on the ground where this is a problem?
So I guess what I don't quite understand is, are things like random build tools, if I invoke Clang, is it going to want to rummage around in that directory and find things with specific names? Or is it just writing things there with specific names and something else picks them up later that's unrelated to some other build tool?
So that's actually somewhat of an, oh, go ahead, Dave.
I would see initially Clang is just going to be write only, but at some point as the tool ecosystem matures, Clang may both do reads and writes. There will be other tools that pick up the writes, the output of Clang, and Yanqui's code is a very, very good example of what could be done. It is one of n, where n is a fairly large number of things that can consume the information. And to Ed's point, I think that it makes a whole lot of sense to be opinionated about where things are so that you don't have to write a ton of if-then logic in each of the tools. Well, if you don't find .bomb, go look for .oid. And if you don't find .oid, you know, look in this environment variable. I mean, those sorts of things are fraught with peril. So, you know, I would see Clang as an initial write only, but it may evolve into something else. And quite frankly, the linkers may also have a validation phase. In other words, a linker may very well pick up the OID of each of the .o files to say, does this actually match the OID that I'm, you know, reading in? So that's an additional validation as the linker is emitting stuff that defines the Merkle tree. And once again, I don't know if Clang is actually a linker as well as a compiler. I don't know, you know, exactly what that tool chain step is, but I could see the linker being something that's going to consume from the directory, you know, consume artifacts that the compiler emits from the directory, so that the linker can actually read in artifacts and validate and generate an additional artifact. Does that make sense, Jeremy?
It doesn't quite jive with my understanding of the data model itself, in that the object files that the linker is reading in themselves should be sufficient to generate all that data. Like, it's not obvious to me why it needs to read something else from that directory.
So let me sort of let me give you my quarter to film thoughts on that matter, right? So there are sometimes things that there's some suggestions I make because I have an intuition about them, and it takes a while to shake out whether it's a good intuition or a bad intuition, right? And so it's very valuable to have a community of people who have different approaches to how they think about it. For example, you're very formal, Jeremy, which I have huge appreciation for, because it shakes out a bunch of things that either allows you to articulate clearly why a thing is being done, or figure out that that particular thing is actually not what you need to do. And so the fundamental questions that sort of come in my mind are, if you're a build tool, you need to have some place to stick the GitBOM documents you're writing, and you need to have some place to stick any auxiliary metadata that you're generating related to this build step. Does that make sense so far?
Okay.
And that there are a variety of things for a variety of reasons that may want to be able to go and find those things for any number of purposes. Like, one might be that at the end of the day, I'd like to sweep up all the GitBOM documents, so when I publish the final results of my build somewhere, I can go publish them. One might, and there are a couple of ways you could do that. One of the ways, and by no means necessarily the best way, but it's the sort of simplest way I've been thinking about, would be to say, okay, if I'm a build tool and I read an artifact in, and I find the related GitBOM documents to that artifact's DAG in .bomb, the .bomb/object subdirectory for the place a subdirectory of where I'm reading the artifact from, I could carry forward any relevant GitBOM documents, and I could just write them out to the directory, the .bomb/objects directory where I'm writing that artifact. And so you sort of carry the relevant information ahead. Now, there's a lot of problems with that very naive thought. There are some things you could do that would make it potentially less problematic. But my first pass thinking was, I know where I'm reading the artifact from. I know where I'm writing the artifact to. If the relevant GitBOM documents are where I'm reading the artifact from, and I can carry them forward, then I have some way of propagating the information to where someone may eventually be looking for it. That was the problem that it was churning in my mind when I sort of made the suggestion. Does that problem seem reasonable to you? Not necessarily the solution, but the problem.
Waiting for Jeremy's answer, and then I'm going to jump in.
Yeah, I think so, within the scope that you're talking about, but I still don't quite see how it fits into the. Sorry, I just want to finish this thought. I think one thing that is perhaps quite implicit in this conversation is that everyone has an understanding of what they think GitBOM is for. But I'm not sure that it's specifically written down clearly enough so that when you're talking about there are myriad things that you could do, like that is actually scoped within some bounds, because there are myriad things you can do, but not all of them are appropriate.
I wrote the white paper, so my answer is the only correct one. Ha ha ha. Kidding.
Okay.
Jeremy, I'd like to try to reformulate your question, both to see if I understood it, what you meant by it, and also test a hypothetical result from it.
Mm-hmm.
Is the artifact itself for every build step in an arbitrarily complex build process, if GitBOM is supported by every tool in that tool chain, and the only thing propagated between discrete steps is the actual output artifact with all the right headers and everything, is that sufficient at the end of the build chain to reconstruct or to demonstrate all the properties that we wish GitBOM to achieve? And I hope someone captured that, but we have a recording. Jeremy, is that sort of the crux of your question?
That is an excellent question.
And I believe
Right.
the answer is absolutely not. Right? The final artifact itself contains only if the hash of the GitBOM document for it. If you think of the entire tree, it's the fingerprint of that tree. That tree has to exist somewhere. Today, we have not described how to compose that tree independently of the steps of propagating all these things along the way. The last build step would only compose point 0 and point 1, sort of the 0th separation and the first separation of fingerprints. The step before it, or all the steps immediately preceding the last step, would have composed degrees 1 to degrees 2, all the way back. So if you have a build chain that is 10 steps long, you need to have what is, n log n nodes potentially of files on disk to compose the full tree, if you want to compose the full tree as a discrete step. Otherwise, you're left with trying to look at and inspect n log n minus 1 artifacts to recompose that. But the last build step, the actual environment of that last build step, only had its inputs. It only had O of 1, or sorry, a 1 degree distance of inputs. It is incapable of, at that point in a build process, describing the entire tree without the cached list of artifacts from preceding steps that are more than 1 degree of separation away in a build system.
Right. So if the question is you want to use GitBOM in order to fully describe the actual build process, then that is necessary. But if you're primarily concerned about the provenance of the build itself, or specifically...
I'm going to interrupt you to be polite and say there's no need for an if there. That is my goal.
Which?
The very first part that you were saying there.
I see.
Not a hypothetical, that is the goal.
Well, is that the goal in itself? Or is that a goal to achieve something else?
Yes. Both.
If the goal, it's like, for example, like the concrete example of, say, here is a file here is a source file that we know has just got a CVE associated with it, and we want to find all of the built artifacts that incorporate that file and therefore might be subject to the same CVE. And so a very, so one way of doing that would be to construct an entire DAG whose single identity encapsulates that entire build that includes that source file. And therefore you can say this output artifact might be affected by that CVE. The other approach might be to say that if you only take if the only thing that matters for any individual build step is what specific files are used as the input, then it's quite possible that you could use that construction to determine that a particular file is not actually relevant to a build, and therefore, even if it's part of the build dependency graph, it's not relevant to specific executables.
don't think I agree with that. The lack of the former implicates the latter. I do believe that we need to have a means to propagate not merely the fingerprint of the build at a given step in the binary, but the calculated OIDs of the inputs and the output across an arbitrarily deep build process, not for the sake of doing an evaluation in the build pipeline itself. And I think that's where you were going just now, Jeremy. Like, yes, there is a potential outcome where someone could use that information in the build process, read in all the stuff in the .bomb folder or .oid folder in later stages of the build process and perform some action based on that input. Totally possible, not my goal. A lot of what I think we're getting hung up on as a group right now are third order implications.
So if I could make a suggestion, I think we've had a very productive discussion trying to work this out. I think you put your finger on something very sort of critical, Jeremy, which I agree with about 80% of the way, which is it's important to sort of figure out what the hell we're trying to do this for. And the reason I only agree 80% of the way is I have this bombastic statement that I like to make, which is that the measure of good architecture is not meeting your requirements. The measure of good architecture, any moron can meet their requirements. The measure of good architecture is being able to deal with new emerging requirements you didn't foresee. And so there's a little bit of if we do this mindfully, it should be generically useful for a lot of things, not all of which will immediately occur to us. But there's also a boil the ocean problem you can get into where you put too many degrees of freedom in the system because of all the imagined possible use cases. And we'd like to avoid falling into that hole as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with you in that a good architecture is one that does achieve its specific goals, but is clearly extensible and can be extended in ways that like do encompass new needs that weren't originally anticipated. And so, yeah, I think we agree on that point, because it is very easy to attempt to design in flexibility for as yet unknown things because it might be useful.
This is why architecture is an art. So if I could make a suggestion, because we're about 45 minutes into the meeting, and this has been a very valuable conversation. Would it make sense for us to try for next time to write down some of the use cases that we perceive? Because even if it ends up not being an exhaustive list, it will at least give us a shell of the kinds of problems that people are trying to solve. Would that be helpful?
Yep.
Cool.
I think
mind, Jeremy?
Very helpful.
Yeah. Now, would you mind, Jeremy, if we moved on to some of the other items in the agenda and looped back to this next week? Because I think it's an important conversation, but I do want to touch on some of the other pieces as well.
Yes, let's carry on.
Okay.
Thank you all. Ed, my thinking is the next thing is the Spec Scope proposal. Does that work for you?
I'm perfectly fine with that. It is the next one up in the direct order.
Great.
Let me go ahead and open that.
Yeah, just
go to the actual file.
Yeah, there we go. So this is pretty rough at this point, but it encompasses a bunch of stuff. I think I'd like to add some wording there, just boilerplate copied in from some other scope documents. But substantively, thoughts, feedback, tomatoes, rotten or otherwise.
I think this is attempting to be the quick summary sentence. And then there's a bunch of call outs to sort of make it clear the breadth of other things that may come in scope.
It looks good to me at this time. Oh, sorry, Ed, go ahead.
Yeah, and several things are called out as guidance, because there's going to be a lot of places where the environment that is bringing GitBOMs in, like Docker containers is going to have to figure out a certain amount of this stuff, but we can sort of provide guidance to help them think about figuring it out based upon the kinds of concerns that we thought through.
A question. There's a specific definition of some of these terms. Should we be linking to those definitions to provide additional context in this scoping document?
You mean definition that is now, I guess, just this morning been merged into the spec itself, right?
Perhaps there or other places. For example, things like artifact has a specific meaning in the context of what we're talking about.
Yes,
But can
I believe we should provide that link. Yep.
Okay, I'm happy to do so. Your hand is up, Dave.
So one of the things I think we're going to need to do is choose a metadata format, because the OIDs themselves, okay, great, but then how do we attach metadata to it? And the logical example or the logical candidates are either JSON or YAML. And I'd like to at least have the discussion about metadata format and also metadata hashing, because the hashing of metadata is going to be important, because at least the way that I've been looking at it, the metadata itself will be nodes in the overall Merkle graph. So figuring out how to deal with that earlier rather than later, I think would be very useful. Do you think that do you think that belongs here, or do you think it's a separate discussion?
David, I think what you're suggesting we include in scope is already here.
Okay.
That last point, line 16. Right, that the scope of the specification could include guidance on metadata.
Okay, fair enough.
Right, and I guess to context set, in case it wasn't clear, this scope document is only applicable to the spec itself and the work on the spec. It is not a scope of GitBOM as a whole, or scope affecting any of the technical projects here. It's just the scope for the work on the specification.
Okay. Thank you.
I saw a hand go up and down and I lost track of it. Was there someone who had something else they wanted to add, or?
That was me. I decided to wait.
Elliot, if you want to, or Jeremy, whichever one.
I just want to make some kind of copy editing notes about.
Oh,
Please do.
please, for the love
take
of
it,
God.
Take it offline. Just do it on
seen,
GitHub. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
You have
Rough
seen
draft.
and corrected my writing. You realize that among the many things I need in life is decent copy editing at all levels and stages. So please, for the love of God.
Well, it's just mostly relates to the earlier point of like, should we just eliminate artifact trees? And since we're not using that term tree as a term in the spec, then
great.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm comfortable with that. This was just sort of a very ham-fisted attempt to incorporate the feedback about pulling in DAGs and data structures for other related data structures for artifacts.
So I think that first sentence needs a big chunk of work, and that's probably what we're going to spend a lot of time on, because it doesn't currently include any word related to build process.
Okay, no, I'm fine with that too.
Some
things you write just so that people can throw tomatoes at them.
Yes.
Most things that I write are just so people can throw tomatoes at them.
I find it very valuable to have to start a conversation with a proposal other people can tear down.
The best way to get people to engage is to give them something to object to.
Yep. Jeff.
Just looking at your line 16, it feels like it is actually beyond just build tools. So perhaps that can be bumped out as well.
Okay, no, that's absolutely fine. And so, I think we're actually to the point in terms of copy editing where some sort of, code rails, quote, quote, suggest would be super, super helpful here. And sort of getting folks engaged on this. To your point, Mel, by the way, going back 20 years, I've used the tactic of submitting a patch that technically fixes the thing I want, that is sufficient to show effort, but insufficient to actually be good, resulting in the actual contributors writing a patch that fixes the bug that doesn't suck. Anyway,
It's a good,
all right.
powerful strategy.
Yep.
Ed is very
work.
good at making work for others.
Sorry, Elliot. All right. Should we go back to the agenda?
Let's do it. I think this, yep. Please do open those comments on that last one.
Mm-hmm. So there was an initial past the spec that got merged. Please note this was only attempt to sort of put a stake in the ground on the things that have been sort of described going into the February 7th launch as something we can then go in and edit the hell out of to get to something that actually reflects the forward evolution of these ideas in the community. So if you look at this and go, hey, this thing I think is important doesn't even represent it here. That's not a rejection of your thought, idea, or concern in any way, shape, or form.
Also, if you have been a vocal proponent of a particular idea in these meetings and you'd like to test that idea with verbiage in the spec, opening a PR with a change set that describes a particular opinion is a great way to get this whole group to really like understand your point of view on something.
Yep. And we've actually had some folks who've done some of that. Some of those things, hopefully, right now, a lot of things have landed as issues. Hopefully more things can land as PRs from here.
And it's entirely reasonable, in my opinion, to have a PR that is there for discussion, not to merge. If you're not familiar with that, you can just add a little caption to it saying like draft or something like that in the description of your PR, so folks know that it's meant to bring it to a meeting and get discussion.
GitHub actually even has a feature, which I do not remember to use reliably, where you can mark a PR as a draft and it's literally not mergeable until you remove its draft status.
I always forget that exists. It's so new.
Yeah,
as in like it's probably
new.
A year old, but new to me.
That sounds about right. I don't always remember to use it, but it's a great way to make sure that nobody gets enthusiastic about your change when you didn't want them to. Cool. Do we?
Few minutes. Ed, do you think we can make progress on any of these in the remaining?
We
6
might
minutes?
make progress on the basic shell of the gitoid URI proposal. Okay. Because it has been sort of bouncing around a while. The things we might want to do with it, we're definitely not going to. But and I apologize, Dave, I need to go and incorporate the good suggestions you've had here.
Mostly just copy edit stuff, small stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot of that, but the basic net of the proposal, and this is in the format that we would file it with the with IANA. Is essentially saying, look, this is a scheme. It's very simple. We're trying to just provide a scheme to point to different kinds of Git objects by their Git object ID. And the scheme is sort of gitoid : the Git object type : the hash algorithm : and the hash value. These are the currently recognized types. And the current valid values for hash algorithm are SHA-1 and SHA-256. Obviously, as that evolves, it's a very logical place to put more. And then the hash value should be expressed in hexadecimal string as lowercase, which apparently I can't spell. And so there's an example here of the Git object ID. You had your hand up, Dave.
Yeah. So a lot of the blockchain folks use base 58. And I'm just wondering whether we want to consider that, because at least some of the technologies I've been looking at that are related to this, some of the zero knowledge proof stuff and the threshold decryption stuff is all base 58 and blockchain. So I'm throwing it out there. I mean, my bias is hex, but I figure I'd throw out base 58 because the cool kids use it.
This proposal isn't ratifying any particular hash algorithm, but rather the IANA template for the format, which includes the agility to use different algorithms in the future. So David, I appreciate the point, but I think that is already included in the impact this would have.
Well, it's not the hashing algorithm, it's the expression of the hash value. So Ed is proposing.
Oh, right there, as hex.
Yeah.
Thank you. I missed that one sentence. Yep.
Yeah,
that one
I
word.
mean, I would want to understand a little bit more why base 58, but the reason that I'd sort of chosen this is a whole lot of what we're doing is trying to hew towards the familiar within how people express these Git things. And Git, when it outputs these values, outputs them as hexadecimal strings with hexadecimal strings with lowercase, which is sort of why I had made that suggestion. Because that way, if I've got this thing, it's easy for me to just clip off the hexadecimal string and look forward to the output of a Git hash object or something else.
Ed, would it be just as easy to have that say a Unicode byte stream where the hash algorithm determines the character mapping relevant for that byte stream?
No, I think hex is fine.
Well, I would like to point out that technically speaking, hexadecimal is a Unicode byte stream in UTF-8.
Yes, which is why I'm suggesting that, because it would not have any impact on SHA-1 or SHA-256, but it would open the door to something in the future. To David's point, I don't have a horse in that race.
No, look, I withdraw my comment or my suggestion, because we're biasing towards the way Git does stuff. Git uses hex. We'll just use hex. So thank you for the conversation.
I think just also for like whatever the representation is, it has to have a single canonical form. And the problem with base 58 is that it's not often not well spec'd. I think someone pointed at a spec, and certainly with UTF-8, there are many ways of representing the same string in UTF-8, and we definitely want this to be a canonicalized representation.
Just a point of clarification, what I sent out was not a pointer to base 58.
So, I mean, the other thing that sort of comes to mind is, and maybe it's just been too long since I've looked at UTF-8, but I thought that UTF-8 collapsed down to ASCII at the end of the day, if you were dealing with ASCII characters.
It does, if you're dealing with ASCII characters.
Right. Okay. Yeah. It gets super complicated with more exotic things, and
yeah, it's a variable byte length format, which is really messy for a lot of tools. But anything that is represented in that first byte, maps back to ASCII cleanly.
Absolutely. So I mean, that was sort of the basic idea. The idea in terms of the semantics was, you wanted to be able to specify an object, and you wanted to be able to do it in such a way that if I gave you the object ID and you had the sets of bytes, you could compute the corresponding ID for the sets of bytes compared to what I'd given you.
And
so I guess
you representing it in UTF-8 would still allow us a very easy one-to-one mapping from Git OIDs today. Like, there's no need for translation if it was that, but I don't understand base 58 well enough to have a comment on that. We're also just about at time.
Yeah, we're just about at time. The other thing I would sort of point out is that the question of string encoding, I think, is orthogonal to the question of URI encoding, because given a URI, I can make any number of choices. I mean, I can validly encode a URI and exit it, for God's sake, and it's still that URI. So it's really a question of the string encoding lives above this, if you will.
Yes. So do we have any objections to the URI format described here? I haven't heard any yet.
Other than a large amount of copy editing, which I will get to.
Okay, if there are no objections, then let's just do a copy edit pass and merge this in the next week or so.
Okay. Okay. And I think we're right at time right now.
Yep. Awesome. Thank you all for a lovely meeting. Happy Tuesday. I hope the rest of all of our weeks are good and not as busy as the first percentage has been. It feels like it's been a week already.
Thank you, everyone.
All right.
See you
Take
all next
care.
week for
Pleasure.
Code
Thanks,
Word.
guys. Later.
Setting this up.